To talk about today. I wanted to walk you through some of the issues that faced Rome, especially after their victories in the Punic Wars and in the East, where they conquered much of Greece and much of that Eastern Greek Empire fell under the control of the Romans. Um, there's there's a ton of good things for Rome, lots of wealth and everything that came pouring into the city, but it also created many new problems. When in most of the ancient world, when you conquer a new land, you also capture many of its peoples, and those peoples are often become slaves, and they did here in Rome as well. Many new slaves were sent back to Rome and its surrounding area, which, as we learned with the Spartans and the Athenians, makes labor much easier, but it also creates a really big problem because if I am a wealthy landowner and I have the ability to have free labor, I often will not want to pay labor. So the plebeians who relied upon that labor, that job, were losing that job. They didn't have land of their own; they were working on other people's land, so soon found themselves displaced. They had nowhere to work. They had nothing they can do, and so those um, rural peasantry got really frustrated. And if you have nowhere to work, there's nowhere out in the countryside to kind of just hang out and be homeless. So those people tended to find their way to the city of Rome. And so what you ended up having was a lot of very poor, unemployed people in the city. And this created problems. Some politicians took up the cause of these poor folks, and the first of this brother tandem that took up the position is a guy by the name of Tiberius Gracchus. Um, Gracchus proposed a series of land reforms, and the basic idea was there is there's so much land owned by so few people. What he wanted to do was maximize the amount of land any one person could own. This would free up land for others to take ownership and allow some of the plebeians to have land of their own. He wanted a little more redistribution of the land, as it were. You can imagine the patricians were not happy about this. And I guess soon after making some of these proposals, an event occurred where Gracchus and many of his followers were murdered in the city. And this was a major event you can imagine. But this didn't stop the reform movement. His brother Gaius took up the call. And Gaius, about 10 years after his brother was murdered, called for even more land reform. He wanted to utilize all of this new land in the provinces, and he wanted that to be given to plebeians so that they would have their own ownership stake in in Rome. He wanted taxes to be changed because right now, as it stood, the patricians were taxing heavily, which meant that those poorer farmers, the ones who were barely making it by, couldn't afford to keep their land. Thus, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. So Gaius tried to push all this through, and like his brother, found serious resistance with the patricians and the Senate, eventually culminating in rioting in the city, where Gaius, like his brother before him, and many of his supporters were killed. So we have a real problem between the very wealthy and the masses of poor. Remember, this should sound familiar to the patricians and plebeians of earlier, right? You have what are called the Optimates Party. This is the party of the senators, the primarily wealthy people. They're very conservative. They wanted land to stay with the people who have owned land for most of the time. They did not like these reform ideas. On the other side, you have the populares, the people, right? The People's Party. And they want these reforms. They're trying to look out for the masses. But these massive changes will have obviously been creating havoc within the political structure. So what happens? Well, when you have two groups and this tension and literal riots happening, this is the time in many governments where you need a strong singular voice to step up. And that's what happens here. You have very powerful military men who step into the position of authority to try to calm everything down. All right? But these military men also have political positions. The first of these men is a guy by the name of Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius is the leader of that Populares party. He is a military leader. He is trying very hard to get land for his soldiers. He would like them to be able to have land. He would like them to share in some of the spoils of war that have all gone back to Rome. He is struggling with this guy, Lucius Sulla, who is very much on the side of the Senate. He is a patrician. He is a major landholder. He is also a military leader. When Sulla is away in the east fighting wars, Marius does something that no one had done before. He gets his army and he marches on Rome. He takes his army into the city to take control of the city, to try to calm things down, to try to push through his reforms. He is basically setting himself up as the sole leader. He does this, but word gets pretty quickly out to Sulla, who brings his own army back to the city. Sulla marches on Marius, and there is a fight, a form of almost civil war, right, between these two armies. Sulla defeats Marius and sets himself up as dictator. And dictator is an actual republican term in Rome. It means someone who is given full power, but for a limited period of time. The idea of a dictator was there are going to be times of turmoil where we need to have some singular voice. But when that turmoil passes, that person needs to leave office and go back to a republic. Now that's tough to do because once someone has power, they will rarely give it up. Sulla, however, does. He goes back into Rome. He sets the Senate back up into their former position. He undoes some of the land reform that Marius had attempted, and then he retires and goes away, hoping that the republic has been restored and things can go back to normal. But things can't go back to normal. There is still this struggle between the rich and the poor. And so what ends up happening is three men, three of the leaders of the Senate and of the people, get together. And these are three military leaders of the time. Each has made their name in different ways. They get together, and it starts off behind closed doors. These three men each have a following, and they realize that if they all get their followers to work together, they can do basically whatever they want, right? Because they have enough followers between the three of them to control the government. So let me talk to you about who these three guys are. First, by the way, this union of these three people, we call it the first triumvirate. Triumvirate just means three men, so it's the first three-man rule. And the three members are, first, Pompey, or Pompey. Pompey is noted for being a great military leader. He is a follower of Sulla, so he is on the side of the Optimates, right? The Senate. He made his name by clearing the Mediterranean Sea out of the of pirates, which might not sound like a big deal. It was huge. He had major victories in the east and in the west. So he's a guy who has made a name for himself as a great general. Marcus Crassus. Also on kind of the optimist side, he is considered to be one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest man in Rome at the time. He made his money through, well, a lot of fraud. You can read a little bit about it here. But he was extraordinarily wealthy. But his wealth enabled him to kind of gather a military force and become a military leader in his own right. And he put down a major slave revolt by a slave by the name of Spartacus. You may have heard of. It's a big movie. And so Crassus had a name for himself there. And the third guy is the one you've heard of. His name is Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is on the other side. He's a popularis. He has made a name for himself in the region of Gaul, which is present-day France. He's been up there fighting wars and really dominating up there and became incredibly famous there. So the three of them joined together: Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Great. Everything seems to be going well for a little while. But after a few years, Crassus is killed in battle. And so you end up having just two guys now, Pompey and Caesar. And the problem about having just these two is these two guys were maybe the bigger rivals of the three. And so there's a bitterness there. Pompey, who happens to be in Rome at the time, looks up to Caesar and sees that he is having all of this success in Gaul. And Caesar's name is being uttered as this great hero in a way that Pompey's name has never been uttered. And so he starts to worry that Caesar is getting too big for his britches. And he convinces the Senate that if they don't control Caesar, Caesar is going to become a dictator. He's going to control things. And remember, the Senate tends to be more optimists, tends to be more of the wealthy folks, whereas Caesar represents the populares. So they call Caesar back. They say, Caesar, you need to come to Rome. And most importantly, come to Rome without your army. All right, because marching an army on Rome would make them a little bit nervous. Caesar recognizes this is a problem, that he may be in a little bit of trouble here, brings his army. He marches down, and once he crosses this river that kind of is the imagined border between Italy and the north, the Rubicon River, he says, the die is cast. Like, I've thrown my die, so whatever happens will happen. I am basically announcing that I am declaring war. And Pompey sees this happening, and Pompey very quickly runs away. Caesar scares the bejeebers out of him. He runs to Greece. Caesar follows him to Greece, defeats him in a battle. Pompey runs to Egypt. Caesar follows him to Egypt. Pompey, unfortunately, bumps into the Pharaoh of Egypt, who sees that Caesar is coming, doesn't want to be blamed for helping Pompey, so the Pharaoh kills Pompey. Caesar, while he's in Egypt, meets Cleopatra, has a child with her. Lots of other fun things happen while he's down there. But the big takeaway is Caesar is now set up as the only ruler of Rome. And he comes back to the city to great, triumphs. People look at him as like, wow, this guy's amazing. And remember, he's part of the populares. The Senate, very nervous that this guy has taken all of this power. He shows up in 45 BCE as the sole leader. Now, there's no real, system in place to deal with this, right? He is in a position that doesn't really exist. So, to kind of codify, to make sure that he is part of the Republican traditions, the Senate votes to make him dictator. And originally, it's dictator for a year, which was the traditional amount of time. During that time, he does a lot of changes. He makes public works. He does land reform. He grants citizenship to more people. He has a ton of reforms that he passes, many of which makes the Senate very nervous. This seems to be like the Gracchus brothers before, making too many changes too quickly. But he is so beloved by the people that the senators don't have much say in this. There's so much support for Caesar that eventually he is elected dictator for 10 years. This is unprecedented. And very quickly after that, the love for Caesar makes it so that he is named dictator for life. And this sets some of the senators off. They realize, uh-oh, we may have created a monster here. This is a guy who now has supreme power. The thing we tried to get rid of, remember, way back 700 years ago from the Tarquins. And on March 15th, which is, I guess, just a couple of days ago. I'm making this on March 16th. On March 15th, the senators conspired, or a group of them conspired, and murdered Caesar on the floor of the Senate. Now, this is going to create problems in its own right, and the next video will talk about what happens upon the death of Caesar and how this republic that had been established is going to transition into an entirely new realm, something we will call the Roman Empire. Once again, if you have questions about this or anything else, please email me. Thank you.